For over 60 years, a driver climbing into a Class 8 tractor in North America grabbed the same shifter pattern, built by the same company, running the same basic idea inside the gearbox. Not a handful of competing designs splitting the market. One transmission family, refined generation after generation, until it became the default answer to a question nobody in the industry was still asking: which gearbox do you buy? That transmission carried the name Fuller, then Eaton Fuller, and its story starts nowhere near a truck at all. In 1885, George Fuller and his three sons were making washboards in Minneapolis. Business was good enough that in 1888, the family moved their operation to Kalamazoo, Michigan, incorporating a year later as the Fuller Brothers Manufacturing Company. Washboards led to other household hardware, and by the early 20th century, the company had pivoted into transmissions for the growing automobile and truck industry. It was an unglamorous transition on paper, a soap and scrub board outfit turning out gearboxes. But Kalamazoo was becoming an unlikely hub of early American automotive manufacturing, and Fuller found its footing there. For decades, Fuller built a solid reputation supplying transmissions to the commercial truck market, competing against several other manufacturers for space in an industry that was still figuring out what a heavy-duty truck even was. Then in 1958, the Eaton Manufacturing Company of Cleveland acquired Fuller outright. At the time, Fuller employed about 300 workers in Kalamazoo and pulled in more than $31 million in annual sales. Real money in an era when the modern interstate trucking boom hadn't even begun. Eaton kept the Kalamazoo operation intact and let Fuller keep building what it already built well. Nobody knew yet that this acquisition would turn out to be, by Eaton's own later account, one of the most profitable purchases the company ever made. The reason came 5 years later, in 1963, when Fuller engineers introduced something genuinely new: the twin-countershaft transmission, marketed under the name Road Ranger. Traditional heavy-duty transmissions ran power through a single countershaft, a design that put enormous stress on individual gears and bearings as trucks grew heavier and engines grew more powerful. Fuller's solution split the torque path across two identical countershafts running in parallel, dividing the load automatically and evenly between them. Engineer Charles Perkins detailed the concept in a 1963 paper for the Society of Automotive Engineers, laying out both the theory and the mechanical execution. The payoff was significant. Because the load was shared, Fuller could use thinner, lighter gears without sacrificing strength, and the transmission could handle dramatically more torque than anything using the old single countershaft layout. Paired with an air-operated range shift system that effectively doubled the number of available gears without doubling the size of the shifter pattern. The Road Ranger gave drivers something that felt, for the first time, purpose-built for the specific punishment of long-haul trucking. Competing manufacturers noticed, and some tried to match the concept. But Fuller had gotten there first, and in an industry where fleet buyers prize proven reliability over novelty, being first with a design that actually worked mattered more than almost anything else. Within a relatively short window, the Road Ranger twin countershaft architecture became the standard the rest of the industry was measured against. Eaton Fuller expanded the lineup into the model numbers that would become common vocabulary on any trucking forum or CB radio for the next half-century: the 9-speed, the 10-speed, the 13-speed, the 15-speed, the 18-speed. Different gear counts for different jobs, but all built on the same twin countershaft foundation Perkins had described back in 1963. What followed wasn't a single dramatic breakthrough moment, so much as decades of quiet, near-total market saturation. Ask a trucker who spent time behind the wheel, anywhere from the 1970s through the early 2000s, what transmission they learned to float gears on, and the answer, more often than not, was some version of a Fuller Road Ranger. Rebuilders and parts suppliers built entire businesses around servicing them, and driving schools taught students to shift them because that's what waited in the truck they'd actually be hired to drive. The twin countershaft Road Ranger wasn't just a popular product. For a huge swath of the industry, it was functionally the only product worth learning. That kind of dominance creates its own kind of vulnerability, because it means an entire industry's muscle memory is built around one design philosophy: the manual, 3-pedal, learn to float the gears skill set that took new drivers months to master and separated the professionals from everyone else. and starting in the late 1990s, that philosophy started to look like a liability rather than a strength. Eaton's own engineers built the first crack in the manual's dominance from the inside. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Eaton introduced the Fuller AutoShift, essentially a familiar 10-speed manual gearbox fitted with electronic shift control. It still had a clutch pedal for starting and stopping, but once the truck was rolling, the system handled the shifting itself. It was a hybrid, a proof of concept more than a finished product, but it demonstrated something the industry hadn't fully reckoned with. A computer could time a gear shift more consistently than a human driver ever would, every single time, without fatigue and without a learning curve. If you're finding the story of how this transmission built and then nearly lost an entire industry interesting, hit subscribe. There's more trucking history exactly like this coming. The real turning point came with Eaton's UltraShift series. Eaton introduced the first UltraShift, a 10-speed fully automated transmission with no clutch pedal at all, in 2003, with full production ramping up in the spring of 2004. It kept the fundamental mechanical DNA of the manual gearbox underneath electronic controls and a computer-actuated clutch. Around the same time, fleet executives started making automation an explicit strategic priority rather than an experimental option. Martin Daum, who ran Daimler Trucks North America in the early 2010s, later described making it his personal mission to shift a market that was still roughly 90% manual transmissions. He wasn't alone. Truck makers across the board began pushing automated manuals as the standard spec rather than the upgrade. The math behind the push was straightforward. Automated systems could hold an engine in its optimal RPM range on every single shift, something even experienced drivers couldn't replicate mile after mile. That precision translated into measurable fuel savings, reduced wear on drivetrain components, and a shorter, cheaper path to getting new drivers licensed and productive. In an industry that has struggled for years to recruit enough qualified drivers, removing the months-long process of teaching someone to float gears on an unforgiving 13-speed wasn't a minor convenience. It was a recruiting advantage. The shift, once it started, moved fast. Kenworth's linehaul truck builds went from roughly 30% automated manual transmissions in 2013 to about 70% by 2018, a near total inversion of the market in just 5 years. At Daimler Trucks North America, more than 90% of on-highway customers were choosing automated manual transmissions within a decade, up from roughly 15% in 2012. Volvo Trucks saw a nearly identical trajectory, with its I-Shift automated transmission climbing from high single digits in 2007 to about 95% of North American orders by 2021. Navistar International said manual take rates had shrunk to just a few percent of total orders. Across nearly every major North American truck manufacturer, the same story played out on a similar timeline. The manual transmission, which had defined the industry for half a century, was being replaced not by a competitor's product, but by an automated version of its own descendants. There's a quiet irony sitting underneath all of that data, though, because the automated manual transmissions that replaced the classic Road Ranger didn't discard Fuller's core engineering breakthrough. Many of them still rely on twin-countershaft architecture descended directly from Charles Perkins' 1963 design, now paired with electronic actuators and computer-controlled clutches instead of a driver's hand on a shift knob and a boot on a clutch pedal. The 3-pedal manual gearbox that made the Fuller name legendary is fading toward museum piece status, alongside the driving skill it demanded. But the mechanical idea underneath it, splitting torque evenly across 2 parallel countershafts to handle more power with lighter components, is still doing the work inside the automated transmissions that replaced it. A soap and scrub board company from Kalamazoo built something in 1963 that turned out to be bigger than the manual transmission it was designed for. It became the blueprint for how American trucks would shift gears, manually or otherwise, for more than 60 years and counting.